You drift now through the innermost gardens of the palace there, ones hidden behind walls so high even the gossip can T-scale them. This isn't the front-facing diplomatic floral theatre anymore. You're in the Sultan's private domain now, where tulips are not politics or performance, but obsession. And this is where things get peculiar. You pass through a small gate beside the harem and find yourself in the Imperial Tulip Conservatory, a place that most courtiers only ever hear about in rumors. Here, the air is different, moister, scented with loam and sweet decay. It smells like expensive dirt, and it should, because that dirt was imported from select valleys in Anatolia and Central Asia, chosen for how well it cradled rare bulbs. This is where the Sultan's most prized bulbs are kept out of the weather under soft filtered sunlight. You witness one quietly from the shadow of a myrtle bush. Some say they were symbolic meditations, meant to center the ruler in a chaotic world. Others think Ahmed just had a flair for pageantry. A few cynics believe it was full-on delusion, a ruler escaping into horticultural fantasy. While his empire burned quietly outside, Ahmed enters wearing robes so pale they look like moonlight, and he bows not to Mecca, not to anyone else, but to the Tulip Dome. He performs a recitation, something between a prayer and a poem, then offers a drop of rose oil on the soil around the flame bulb. It's more like worship than gardening. The bureaucracy is bloated, the janissaries are restless, and European powers are modernizing fast. Ahmed can't control any of that, but he can control this garden. He can name a tulip and decide when it blooms, and who gets to see it. Power, reduced to petals. There's even a sealing mechanism, hand-cranked, that adjusts slats of wood to simulate different seasons. The Sultan accepts it silently, folds the paper without reading it, and returns his gaze to a bulb beginning to swell with green. The other replies, "At least it's prettier than the past." A message, unopened, a flower, watched with trembling patience. That's the balance he's chosen. The Sultan's shadow lengthens behind you, framed by leaves and petals that may never bloom again, one bulb no taller than your thumb is. Protected under a glass dome, it's said to have originated from the ancient gardens of Shiraz. No one knows its name. It's just called the Flame. Each rare bulb is catalogued, some housed in hand-painted ceramic pots with gold inscriptions. The Sultan visits often, usually at dusk trailing. Fewer attendants each time. This is his sanctuary, his escape from court, family, and empire. The entries are written with an elegance that feels almost sacred. Autumn. Year 1139, the blood-veined ivory from Bursa bloomed weekly. There are old varieties that no longer bloom. Some overbred, fragile hybrids collapsing under their own intricacy. A few wild ones, still bold and vibrant. He doesn't want more land. He wants that petal to unfurl just right. But the majority are delicate, high maintenance, and fading. No fragrance. Petals too proud. The judgment sounds more like a review of court behavior than a flower. Gardens surround you, but they're not arranged by color or symmetry. No, Ahmed III's personal garden is organized like a scholar's library. By genus, by age, by scentlessness, by curling of petal tip. You see gardeners with brushes smaller than a teardrop, gently dusting pollen from one flower to another, making hybrid after hybrid. This is tulip alchemy. No one speaks. It's all gestures, soft sandals on packed soil, and the occasional whisper light. The new white flame from Cornea didn't bloom. Whether that flower ever bloomed or existed is still debated, but the idea alone tells you plenty. Mainstream fact. Ahmed III employed a full-time head gardener, known as the Boston Kabaki, whose authority extended beyond palace, flora to river patrols, and even executions. Yes, in classic Ottoman efficiency, the guy arranging your dahlias could also cut your head off if you displeased the Sultan. Imagine your local florist with legal jurisdiction. It's all very on-brand. But here, in the garden, the mood is hushed reverence. The tulips are watched like sacred relics, a fringed tidbit. Some whispered accounts suggest that Ahmed III once commissioned a tulip variety that bloomed only at night, believing that true beauty should not beg for attention. You follow a narrow path to a smaller, covered courtyard, and here's where things tip into ritual. The Sultan doesn't just admire the flowers. He holds ceremonies around them. Private ones. Historians still argue whether these ceremonies were real or exaggerated by later chroniclers. You step back as the head gardener brings forth a bulb ledger, a massive codex listing every planting, every bloom date, every crossbreed. You begin to notice the tulips are starting to resemble the empire. You catch Ahmed staring at one bloom with a kind of exhausted longing. There's a certain madness in it. Yes, but also something heartbreakingly human. The empire is massive and imperfect. A courtier enters, bowing low with a scroll in hand. News of a provincial skirmish. Later, as you leave the garden, you hear one servant whisper to another. He thinks he's growing the future. You'll step through a carved archway, back into the echo of the empire's heart. You're back in the streets of Istanbul now, but they don't look like the Istanbul of travel brochures or empire-building montages. They smell sweeter. For one thing, like cloves, apricots, and a dusting of sugar. You pause near a sherbet vendor. He hands you a delicate glass of cherry pomegranate infusion, chilled with snow shaved off the distant mountains. The glass is decorated with you guessed it, a tulip motif, gold, curling, almost smug in its You're in a market quarter, in full bloom figuratively and literally. Everything seems to shimmer with a dreamy, slightly unreal sheen. The tulip may have been the crown jewel, but the throne was made of sherbet, silk, music, poetry, and rosewater fountains. You walk past perfumeries, blending rose and ambergris into scents that could lull a tiger, which is biologically nonsense, since tulips are famously unscented. A child fills her jug beneath it while her mother adjusts her embroidered shawl. The embroidery, tiny tulips. Of course, the motif is everywhere woven into turbans, glazed onto tea sets, carved into the wooden lattice of homes. It's as if the entire city has agreed on a theme. Still, they mixed roses and crushed herbs into fragrant illusions, sold as tulip extract to anyone desperate enough to believe a fantasy, not with torchlight but with the low, humming energy of a civilization temporarily convinced that beauty might be enough. To believe that rosewater fountains and perfectly folded caftans can form a kind of soft armor. The tulip may be blooming, but so are cracks in the mosaic. You sip another it's flavored with saffron and pear blossom. Ridiculous. Divine. Completely unnecessary. But isn't that the point? That delicacy could protect, that refinement could delay ruin, and let, be honest, UD probably fall for it too in a world this drenched in symbolism. Silk shops shimmer in every direction, the fabrics so light they ripple with the mere suggestion of wind. This is the height of the tulip era, when luxury oozed into everyday life like honey on warm bread, a delicate balance, a fluttering petal caught between bloom and decay. Was it just trickle-down culture from the court, or a wider expression of longing for stability in a time when the empire's military and political grip were loosening? The answers are muddled like muddled mint in sweet, refreshing, and hard to separate. Ottoman society during this period wasn't just about flowers. It was about creating an entire sensory experience of beauty and refinement. The melodies rise like smoke, coiling through doorways and pulling your thoughts into a haze. It's no wonder the Ottomans fell under this spell for a time. The world here feels designed to lull, to soothe, to cushion you in delicate distractions. Middle class, families especially, artisans, scribes, and shopkeepers began growing tulips in clay pots on their windowsill. The merchant greets you with a practiced bow and an offer. Bolt after bolt of fabric, all imported, all exquisite, all shimmering with threads of gold and tulip patterns. But this time, he shows you something new. A commissioned robe made entirely of mirrored silk panels, each one reflecting light so that it sparkles like petals in the morning sun. A gift for a vizier's wedding, he says with a wink. To remind him of him, he doesn't need to. A miniature tulip bed in a courtyard was like having a Pinterest-perfect kitchen taste, and vibes, all in one package. Mainstream fact. Istanbul in the early 18th century became a thriving center for arts and commerce. A scribe leans over his workbench, sketching petals around the margins of a poem so sorrowful you can feel it humming through the ink. You don't even need to read Ottoman Turkish to know what it is about. Longing, probably, or loss. It's always longing or loss. The city saw a rise in consumer goods, especially among the elite and wealthy merchant classes, mirroring early modern trends in Europe. Think of it as Ottoman less military glory, more interior decorating. And it wasn't just the palaces. You stop at a bookshop and notice an entire volume dedicated to floral verse. The calligraphy alone is enough to slow your breath. A fringe tidbit. Some perfume makers in this era claimed to have created tulip scent. You pass a public fountain shaped like a tulip stem, water pouring softly from petal-shaped spouts. Historians still argue whether this bloom of bourgeois beauty was organic or encouraged from above. You continue down a street where musicians play soft ney flutes and frame drums, offering a soundscape more hypnotic than upbeat. You duck into a silk shop. You step back out into the dusk. The city glows. It's easy to get swept up in it. Then someone passes you muttering about raised taxes. Another grumbles about corruption in the guilds. A third coughs into a rag. Eyes tired, still. For a moment, it's all sherbet and silks. The empire holds its breath. And you keep walking, gently, as if not to disturb it. You wander deeper into the empire's dreamscape, shops beyond the sherbet stalls, and emerge into the kind of scene that feels less like a capital city and more like a fever dream, spun by a poet with too much access to the royal treasury. It's nighttime again, and the Bosphorus glitters under lanterns floating on tiny carved boats, each shaped like a lotus or a tulip or not a miniature peacock. You've arrived at one of the grand imperial fetes. These are no mere banquets. They are entire productions, part theater, part hallucination, and then the show begins. And the Sultan, he's the director, producer, and starring role. Of course, it flaps once awkwardly, because someone's cranking it too hard behind a velvet screen, but the effect still lands. Courtiers gasp. Music starts, flutes and lutes, and soft drums, and along the canal bank, fountains leap to life in synchrony, their water scented with orange blossom. Tonight's celebration, there are dancers painted in gold dust, spinning slowly in time with the music. A small stage features a puppet operess that is a thin depict in a tulip bulbous, tragic love affair with a drop of morning dew. Some argue they helped maintain order by projecting imperial magnificence like Louis XIV's court at Versailles. Others claim it was precisely this endless carnival that disconnected the elite from the real, growing unrest simmering in the streets. You spot Ahmed III himself on a raised pavilion, robed in deep plum with a tulip pinned at his collar. He's clapping softly, barely smiling. You notice how pale he looks under the lantern glow. Is he tired? Or is this the only way he can still feel in control? A bit melodramatic, sure, but the crowd is eating it up, and the mechanical swan is half sunk at the far end, looking a bit like it regrets its life choices. Guests begin to wander home slowly, silks rustling, half drunk on sherbet and moonlight. Well, it might be a birthday, a circumcision, a diplomatic reception, or possibly just Tuesday. She catches it, laughs, and runs off. She doesn't care about diplomacy or decline, just tulips and the way they flutter, to make you forget borders, battles, taxes, and treaties. The quiet after beauty is sometimes louder than the party itself. When the music plays and the lanterns glow, you're not in a crumbling empire, in a dream palace, where every detail has been choreographed for your delight. The point is, less the reason and more the experience. The financial toll grows with every floating lantern and every gold-threaded tent, but none of that is visible tonight. The only thing you see is beauty perfect, shimmering, fleeting. As you settle among the crowd of wide-eyed attendees, a hush falls over the gardens. The woman next to him frowns, but keeps sipping her rose syrup. Out on the canal, a giant mechanical swan glides into view. Mainstream fact. One of the most famous events during the Tulip era was the 15-day celebration in 1724. Ahmed III's grandson's circumcision. It featured floating gardens, theatrical performances, puppet shows, exotic animals, fireworks, and opulent displays of wealth across East. Thousands of artisans were involved. The city turned into a stage, but it wasn't just about extravagancy, it was a kind of empire-wide SMR. Every movement, every detail, every flower petal was chosen to evoke awe and serenity. The Ottomans, weary of endless war, needed a different kind of spectacle. Something quieter, softer, a fringed tidbit. Some accounts describe tiny paper lanterns, shaped like tulips, being set afloat on the Bosphorus, with live crickets inside so that the lanterns not only glowed, but chirped gently as they drifted out to sea. Whether that's true or just a poetic flourish from a courtier desperate to impress his diary, you'll never know. But the image sticks in your mind like a dream fragment. You move through the revelers. Everything is opulence wrapped in delicacy. Even the deserts are over the top. Historians still debate whether these fetes were politically useful or dangerously. You hear a whisper from a bearded scholar standing near the sherbet cart. A floating garden does not float forever. Above you, fireworks bloom in tulip-shaped bursts. Even the fireworks are on theme and the crowd sighs collectively. This spectacle isn't cheap. Each event costs a fortune in materials, labor, security, and imported luxuries. That's the thing about these parties. They're designed to suspend time. And you float through it, untethered, a ghost in a garden of ghosts. By the time the celebration ends, the canal is littered with drifting petals. The Sultan retreats into his pavilion. Someone carefully extinguishes the tulip-shaped lanterns. The garden begins to dissolve back into night. You stay for a while longer, just watching, listening, and as you turn to go, you notice a child chasing a single paper tulip blown loose from the canal. It's a moment, like all of this, that vanishes the moment you try to hold it. The celebration still flickers behind your eyes as you walk away from the glowing canals and the sherbet-drenched nights. But now you drift westward across land, across empires, across centuries of shared fascination toward a place you wouldn't expect to find Ottoman echoes, the tulip-crazed marshlands of the Netherlands. Here, too, tulips had become more than flowers, because, believe it or not, The bulb that would later bring elegance to Topkapi also sparked one of history's most infamous market crashes. They were financial assets, fever dreams, status symbols for a merchant class, with too much time, too much money, and apparently not enough Yes. Tonight, your sandals squished gently through a field in 17th century Holland, not long before Ahmed's reign began. People were buying and selling the promise of bulbs before they had even been planted, let alone bloomed. At one point, a single Semper Augustus bulb, famous for its crimson and white flame-like petal zoos, said to cost more than a ship. Ahmed's courtiers hear the rumors, chuckle politely, and keep cultivating their own tulip obsession, but with slightly different stakes. The timeline suggests a bit of both. European ambassadors brought stories of Dutch tulip fashions to Istanbul, and Ottoman traders observed how Europe had aestheticized the flower. But while the Dutch turned tulips into a stock exchange, the Ottomans turned them into art. In the Ottoman world, tulips weren't about profit. The walls are filled with delicate watercolor tulips, painted with impossible symmetry, each one a meditation on restraint. But the Ottomans never quite lost their heads the way the Dutch did. Instead of economic collapse, they risked cultural disconnect. Unlike Dutch portraits of big, blousy bulbs, these tulips are tall, narrow, elegant, and yet we still cannot print a book without a fight. They lean slightly, as if bowing. There's no garish flamboyance here, just poise. Gardeners hover anxiously, inspecting the roots, weighing each bulb. One is placed in a porcelain dish with velvet lining. It's not a flower, it's an heirloom. They were about elegance, prestige, and soft power. Still, the stories from the Dutch experience seemed to hover in the background like a cautionary fable. This part of the story doesn't technically belong to Ahmed III, but you can't understand Ottoman tulip mania without passing through the Dutch variety. Mainstream fact. In the 1630s, Dutch experienced a speculative bubble known as tulip mania, during which prices for rare tulip bulbs soared to outrageous heights, sometimes worth more than a skilled worker's annual wage, or even a townhouse on a canal. One man shouts, waving a painted sketch of a tulip with dramatic stripes. In the Ottoman Empire, the risk was subtler, more emotional. When a society pours its dreams into flowers, what happens when the petals fall? And then, it isn't. In 1637, the market crashes. Bulbs become worthless overnight. Some traders are ruined. There's a column for bloom time, another for color intensity, and a third quietly ominous for death. Yes, each bulb had a death date. That's the thing about tulips. They're glorious, but they fade. Quickly, others just quietly plant their outrageously overpriced flowers and pretend it was all for the love of gardening. The streaking is caused by a virus, makes it rarer, he insists. Yes, you're hearing that correctly. A virus-induced pattern defect made tulips more valuable. And then, just as suddenly, the market collapsed. You step into a candlelit tavern in Harlem, where traders in ruffled collars argue about petals, the way modern folks argue about crypto. A fringe tidbit: there was an actual futures market for tulips. You watch the fever build. Merchants swap bulbs like poker chips. Debts mount. Everyone insists this is the new normal. Now you zoom forward back across the water to Istanbul, where tales of this European flower madness have trickled in. Historians still argue whether Ahmed's tulip craze was consciously modeled after the Dutch example or developed in parallel. You stroll through an Ottoman painter's studio. That said, there was a bit of Ottoman speculation. Bulbs were bought and sold. Rare varieties became the hot commodities of the elite. And that's the difference. In Holland, the crash affected commerce. You glance again at Ahmed's tulip ledger. You imagine Ahmed flipping that ledger page slowly, reading the death dates like a calendar of vanishing dreams. In some corner of the court a scholar frowns. "All this for a flower," he mutters. And there it is, again, the quiet, steady tension between the bloom and the ink, between art and reform, between floating swans and crumbling systems. You return to Istanbul in time to see a shipment of bulbs arrive from abroad. Some are from France, others from Holland. They're treated like royal guests. The garden swells, again with anticipation. A new spring approaches, and somewhere in the palace, the Sultan adjusts his robe and pens a verse. "Let none disturb the garden's peace, though storms may rage beyond its walls." And just like that, the tulips bloom again tall, pale and silent. It's morning now, the kind where sunlight slides over marble like warm honey, and the call to prayer echoes soft and distant, woven through birdsong. You're back in the palace, standing in the Sultan's library as he had one, and it's not what you expected. There are no towering shelves or dusty scrolls here. It's airy, quiet, and filled with the scent of polished cedar and faintly sweet ink. This is where the tulip era begins to get its intellectual shine. You settle onto a cushion near a low table scattered with a scribe dips his reed pen into ink, carefully copying a translated European text about astronomy. This came in 1727, thanks to the work of Ibrahim, a Hungarian convert to Islam, who established the first official Ottoman printing house with the Sultan's approval. On the wall hangs a miniature showing a tulip blooming out of a globe, maybe of the empire's desire to find beauty even in science. It's faster, one argues. It's impersonal, counters another. Purely decorative, but banned from use by the palace gardeners, who insisted such mechanical understanding spoiled the mystery of blooming. It's one of those deliciously odd intersections of science and superstition. French especially, because France was the empire's current frenemy of choice, envied, emulated, and occasionally mocked. The manuscript trade, painstaking, handwritten, beautiful, had been the empire's pride. Their teacher, an elderly man with a beard like spun wool, nods approvingly as a student recites a line that compares the brief life of a tulip to the soul's journey through the world, brilliant, brief, gone too soon. They sit in silks dye the color of plums and apricots, their hands busy with embroidery. Tulips again stitched into veils, cuffs, slippers. But his gardener still plants Ottoman tulips, because they re the only ones that know how to die beautifully. Some say Ahmed didn't fully understand what he was unleashing. Others believe he knew exactly what he was doing. Kind of bloom, intelligence, curiosity. The women of the harem weren't just decorative. Children run past it, their shoes kicking up dust. But as a man who tried to balance ink and perfume, knowledge and elegance, reform and ritual, one bends to smell a flower that doesn't smell, and laughs anyway. Many were multilingual, highly educated, and influential behind the scenes. The petals fall. Some even corresponded with foreign queens and consorts, exchanging perfumes, poetry, and yes, tulip bulbs. Easy to see the silks, the poems, the parties, and dismiss it as a gilded distraction. But in this quiet corner of the palace, surrounded by books and ledgers and tulips drawn in the margins, you begin to wonder if that beauty was a form of resistance. Printing, it felt mechanical, vulgar, even like turning sacred calligraphy into wallpaper. Scrolls and ledgers are stacked like sleeping cats. There's one ledger listing trade routes for bulb imports, another more battered tracks, complaints from provinces, bad roads, crooked taxmen, grain theft. Mainstream fact. one of the most meaningful reforms of Ahmed III's reign was the reintroduction of the printing press into the empire for non-religious books. At least, slowly, cautiously, only books on science, geography, religious texts remained strictly the domain of human scribes. A compromise soothed tempers, but you hear the low buzz of discussion as courtiers, scholars, and translators debate the merits of printed knowledge, a tulip of a different kind, one that spreads ideas instead of petals. But Ahmed allowed it. You watch as a newly printed book is passed from hand to hand. It's not just paper, it's a shift in thinking. Historians still argue whether this reform came too late or whether it was one of the few genuinely forward-looking moments in a court otherwise drowning in perfume and poetry, a fringe tidbit. According to legend, one of the earliest printed Ottoman books contained a diagram of tulip anatomy. You step into the nearby imperial school, where boys in crisp robes are memorizing verses from both the Quran and classical poetry. Education flourished during this time, at least among the privileged. New schools were funded, and foreign languages began to seep into elite curricula. You overhear an aristocrat boasting that his new courtyard is built in the French style. And there it is, again, that obsession with the fleeting, the poetic death. In one chamber, you find a group of ladies from the imperial harem listening to a recitation of tales from the 1001 Nights. But beyond the whispers and giggles, something else simmers here. You pass through the hallway where the library transitions into the palace archive. The contrast is sharp. In one room, printed books and scholarly reform. In the next, inked laments from starving peasants. You feel the tension, again beauty stacked precariously on dysfunction. A young scribe looks up and says, "They want the mind to bloom like a garden." You ask, quietly, if it ever does. He shrugs. Sometimes the weeds win. Outside the library, a tulip garden stretches across a marble courtyard. You linger for a moment longer, thinking of Ahmed not as a distant ruler. It's easy to mock the tulip era as frivolous, against time, against decay, against forgetting. The presses roll on, slowly, quietly. You step away from the quiet hush of the palace library and into the hum of the city beyond, where ink and ideas rarely trickle. This is the other Istanbul of butchers and bricklayers, boatmen and beggars. The Ottoman tulip obsession may have reached the clouds in the palace, but down here, the petals don't fall so softly. You walk through a neighborhood near the Golden Horn, where the streets are muddy, the bread's gone dry, and people don't speak in poetry. They speak in complaints. You pass a blacksmith hammering out horseshoes, muttering to himself. They plant flowers while our children chew gravel. Mainstream fact. As the tulip era bloomed among the elite, tensions simmered in the empire's belly. Taxes were rising, particularly in the province, where governors eager to keep up with Istanbul's expensive fashion squeezed local populations harder than ever. "I need wool that doesn't cost my last tooth." His friend, a tanner, just laughs bitterly. He never explained why, but everyone understood it. Maybe we should start selling petals. You watch as a few of them polish their weapons with a distracted air. In a madrasa courtyard, a group of scholars discuss the moral implications of Ahmed's reign. One of them frowns deeply and quotes a verse about vanity. "The Prophet loved modesty," he says. "Not fireworks, not fountains made to sing like birds." Everyone still smiles at the tulip parades, still claps politely when fireworks bloom like flowers in the sky. But behind the smiles is a question they dare not voice too loudly. "What is all this for?" The Sultan throws fates, one mutters, while our sabers rust. Even in the capital, food prices soared, and wages barely kept pace. Ottoman sources from the time are cagey, often sanitized. But the signs are there in scattered petitions, in the defiant verses of folk poets, and in rumors that grew legs of their own. They don't speak in fury. They speak in sorrow. You hear her mutter, "Tulips don't feed babies. Is that the Sultan's kind?" one asks. It stretches wide, uneven, alive, and though its rooftops glint in the setting sun, you can't help but feel the light is thinner than before. "No," the other says, "ours don't last." A sense that something sacred has been dressed in glitter and hung from a chandelier, and that the empire, in turning inward, the beauty, it turns out, wasn't free. Inside, the discussion is growing heated. A shoemaker slams his hand on a table. "Enough tulips? I want boots that lasts through a winter." You overhear another manor weaver, this time grumbling over coffee. The palace needs new lanterns for tulip festivals, and the more it bloomed, the more it became a mirror reflecting the opulence of a few and the discontent of many. The further you walk, the more the divide becomes apparent. The public fountains sparkle in wealthy quarters, while in the poor districts, people wait hours for water that runs rusty. The scent of tulip oils in the palace contrasts with the sharp temps of tallow and sweat down here. There's no sherbet, no silk, just the steady ache of a society tilted too far in one direction. You pass a guild hall where artisans gather after work. Historians still argue whether this frustration was widespread or limited to pockets of urban unrest. A fringe tidbit. It's said that one disgruntled tax collector, fed up with transporting gilded tulip pots while collecting rice from starving villagers, carved a tulip upside down into his walking stick. Back in the city, you find yourself among the janissaries, the elite corps of soldiers once feared across Europe, now increasingly restless, increasingly political, and increasingly underpaid. There's an unease in the air, the kind you feel in your shoulders before a storm. And then there's the religious element. You sit quietly at the edge of the gathering. Still, no rebellion yet. Just grumbling, a thread pulled here, a whisper there. You pass a street poet performing under a bridge, his voice lilting with sarcasm. "They planted tulips in our mouths, so we would forget the taste of bread." The crowd laughs, then quickly disperses. Laughter is dangerous. So is truth, wrapped in rhyme. You pause to watch two boys tossing pebbles at a wilted flower bed. It's a small moment, but it sticks with you. By now, you realize the garden Ahmed grew was never meant to include everyone. A woman walks by carrying a jug. Her hands are cracked, her headscarf faded. You don't need a scholar to interpret that. As you head back toward the palace walls, you look over your shoulder at the city behind you. The tulips may still bloom in Topkapi, but the soil beneath is shifting. Night falls again, and this time it's heavier. There's a certain tightness in the air, like everyone's waiting for something to snap. You're in the palace again, but it's no longer humming with laughter and lute strings. It wasn't a foreign invasion or a palace coup, it came from within. A man named Patrona Halal, once a janissary, led a populist uprising that would bring the tulip era crashing down in a matter of days. The corridors feel longer, the marble colder. Even the tulips seem to droop just slightly, as if aware that their golden hour has passed. Ahmed III sits quietly in a private salon, surrounded by a dwindling circle of advisors. The sherbet is untouched. The musicians have packed away their instruments. Outside, the wind carries something sharper than spring air. It carries the scent of change. The gardener tasked with planting it reportedly wept while doing so, not from joy, but because he knew it would be the last. Complaints from the provinces, appeals for relief, reports of unrest. Each one sealed, set aside. The empire had been sending smoke signals, but no one, it seems, opened the window. The hybrids he dreamt of have finally bloomed colors. no one's ever seen before. A streaked violet white that glows under moonlight, a crimson so deep it looks black in shadow. But no one's celebrating, not anymore. Mainstream fact. In 1730, the long-simmering unrest in Istanbul finally erupted into open rebellion. One by one, they're snuffed out, not ceremonially, but by the wind, as if the empire itself is sighing. One tightens his grip on a spear, another looks at the horizon as though expecting it to crack open. Just a simple tunic, sleeves rolled, dirt under his fingernails. He's replanting a bulb with the care of a father dressing a wound. You hear him murmur something in Ottoman Turkish genta, almost like a lullaby. He finishes the planting, wipes his hands, and walks away without looking back. They speak of taxes, yes, but also about honor, duty, and the humiliations they've endured while the elite danced under tulip lanterns. You're not there yet, but the murmurs are growing louder. At the edge of the city, in coffee houses and workshops, men talk in tones that blend grudge with momentum. One carpenter folds a flyer into a triangle and mutters, "Let's see if flowers can stop fire." The city still glows in parts, but there are darker smudges, now places where fires have started to burn, not for warmth or celebration, but for change. Back at the palace, Ahmed senses it too. His routines begin to fray. Fewer garden walks, fewer poetry readings. The tulip festivals go on, but they're shorter and a bit more strained. Not to stop history from knocking down the garden gate, not of a man he's still alive, still breathing, but of a dream. A long, scented dream that tried to hold back history with art, with elegance, with ephemeral blue. You see it in the servant's eye sphere, tightly leashed. The air of a dream reaching its edge. Historians still argue whether Ahmed was truly unaware of the brewing rebellion, or simply too steeped in ritual to react in time. Some claim he believed beauty would calm the people. Others suggest he was simply perilously trapped by his own curated world of scented illusions. A fringe tidbit. In the final weeks before the rebellion, Ahmed supposedly commissioned a tulip bed shaped like a crescent moon, hoping its symmetry would reharmonize the empire. In a secret corner of the palace, you stumble upon a room full of unopened letters. You find Ahmed again in his personal garden. He stands alone, no robes, no crown. The irony, his tulips are at their peak. You walk past a line of guards, shifting nervously in their boots. And soon it will. The tulip lanterns flicker that night with an almost mocking glow. In a courtyard that once hosted music and verse, a single tulip petal falls onto cold stone. No one notices. You keep walking through the darkening palace, aware that you're witnessing a farewell. And now that dream is unraveling. You reach a balcony and look out over Istanbul. You hear drums in the distance. Not music, not celebration. These are marching drums. And you realize the tulips were never enough. Not to hold an empire, not to quiet a rebellion. The dawn after rebellion always feels strange, like the world's holding its breath, trying to remember what it was before the chaos. You find yourself back in the city streets, but they're transformed. The palace gates, once symbols of imperial beauty, now look more like cages strapping the remnants of a world that's been overturned. The usual buzz of Istanbul's markets is undercut by a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional shout or the clatter of hurried footsteps. Patrona Halil, former janissary turned rebel leader, gained significant influence, marking a shift toward a more militaristic and populist government. Whether true or not, the image sticks. Beauty turned against its creators. Fragile petals transformed into projectiles of fury. The delicate tastes of the court were replaced with raw power struggles and harsher realities. Patrona Halal and his followers have stormed the city, and the tulip era's glittering dream has shattered. Now, torn pages flutter in the wind, their words lost or rewritten by history. On the other, the raw energy of a new era, unpredictable and fierce. She cradles it gently, as if it's the last piece of a fairy tale she refuses to forget. The artists, once patrons of tulip culture, have fled or gone silent. Mainstream fact. The rebellion forced Ahmed III to abdicate, ending the tulip era abruptly. Through rebellion, ruin, and rebirth, it remains a symbol of a moment when an empire dared to dream in color and scent. You weave through the crowd, some jubilant, others terrified. Statues of tulips are smashed, their petals crushed underfoot like broken promises. Perhaps a stubborn hope, or simply a reluctance to let the past die entirely. Political power struggles. Likely it was all of these, and more, a complex knot of grievances, fears, and shattered dreams, tangled in the petals of tulips. The scented fountains have been drained, the gardens trampled by angry boots. The very symbols that once represented refined beauty now serve as scapegoats for discontent. A fringe tidbit. It is whispered that some rebels used tulip bulbs as weapons, throwing them like stones at palace windows. You pass a burnt-out coffee house where poets once gathered, their verses swirling like smoke in the air. Yet, amid the destruction, you notice something strange: a few surviving tulip beds, tended quietly by servants or gardeners who risk punishment to keep them alive. Historians still argue about the rebellion's true causes. Was it purely economic frustration? Religious pushback? You find yourself at a crossroads in the city. On one side, the glittering remains of the old court, fading fast. You pause, watching a small child pick a lone tulip from the ruble. The tulip's bloom is brief, but its story endures. And maybe, just maybe, that dream still whispers in the gardens of Istanbul. The city breathes differently, now less gilded, more raw. You find yourself drifting through the bustling bazaars where the scent of spices still lingers, but the mood has shifted. You stumble across a small shop, tucked between a spice merchant and a carpet seller. Its windows are fogged with age, but inside, rows of delicate porcelain vases still bear tulip motifs, their colors faded but unmistakable. Tulips no longer command the conversation. Instead, talk is about rebuilding, about survival, about what comes next. The extravagant displays of the tulip era were replaced with renewed emphasis on religious piety and military strength. The tulip, he says, is not just a flower, it is patience, it is remembrance. However, the artistic influence of tulip motifs persisted in Ottoman decorative arts for centuries. Tulips have become less about spectacle and more about memory. Some see it as a fleeting distraction, others as a crucial moment that softened the empire's edges and prepared it for centuries of transformation. Yet even as the empire recovers from rebellion, the legacy of the tulip refuses to fade completely. Their petals are a bit ragged, but they nod proudly in the breeze. Survivors of storms, seen and unseen. Mainstream fact. After the rebellion, the Ottoman Empire entered a more conservative phase politically and culturally. He tells you that despite the turmoil, families continued to plant tulips in their gardens, not for politics, not for profit, but because they loved their quiet, fleeting beauty. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with kind eyes, notices your gaze and smiles softly. You watch as he carefully unwraps a porcelain tulip-shaped cup. It's glazed, chipped, but still beautiful. The craftspeople speak quietly of tradition and renewal, passing down their skills through generations. A fringe tidbit. In the years following the rebellion, some Ottoman poets began using tulip imagery to symbolize both the fragility of life and the resilience of the spirit. One particularly famous poet wrote of a tulip that survived a harsh winter, blooming where all else had turned to frost. You wander through an artisan's workshop where carpets woven with tulip patterns are still made by hand, each not a tiny echo of the era past. Outside, the call to prayer rises again, a reminder that life endures beyond the rise and fall of fashions and salt. Historians still argue how much the tulip era influenced later Ottoman culture. You step into a garden, now not a palace garden, but a humble courtyard filled with wild tulips growing untended, and as you watch, you realize that while the empire's politics changed, the tulip's quiet elegance remained a flower both delicate and defiant, perfectly imperfect. You breathe in the centaur. Maybe it's just memory and walk on, carrying a piece of that bloom with you. You move beyond the city now, into the Anatolian, where time drips slower and history curls like smoke above old tea kettles. Here, far from Istanbul's palaces and pashas, the tulip never needed a rebellion to fade it, just sank quietly into the soil, returning to the hands of farmers and villagers who never once called it glamorous. Someone is hanging laundry and someone else is planting early spring bulbs in a patch of earth barely wider than a blanket. Long before they were fetishized by the elite, they bloomed freely across hillsides, wild and quietly, unbothered by markets, revolutions, or poetry. She doesn't call them tulips. She has another name for them, something softer, older, passed down from her grandmother's grandmother. She explains how they bloom for only a few days, but always return. They're loyal, she says with a shrug, then offers you a cup of bitter black tea. The flowers are simple, red and yellow and slightly not imported hybrids, just the hearty local tulip that's been growing here since long before Ahmed had his first sherbet. My Baba says they come up red like jam. You buy one, she throws in a second. That one's crooked. But it tries. You pass through a dusty village where the houses are made of mud brick and the roads are carved more by hooves than heels. Mainstream fact. Tulips were native to Central Asia and Anatolia, long before they reached Europe or the Ottoman court. You can almost believe Ahmed once walked these roads, perhaps dreaming of a life not tangled in silk and ceremony. But in villages like this, the rhythm of tulips continues. Planted, bloomed, forgotten, an old woman, hunched but sharp-eyed, beckons you over to show you her garden. In some Anatolian villages, tulips are planted not for beauty, but for luck. One old belief holds that if the first bloom of spring faces your house, the year ahead will bring calm. If it faces away, prepare for hardship. Not exactly courtly symbolism, but far more practical. The fringe tidbit here. You walk along a ridge above the village and see the hills dotted with wild tulips swaying in the wind. No fences, no gilded planters, just flower after flower dancing freely under the sky. Did the palace borrow from the soil? Or did the soil absorb the palace's dreams and carry them back out, diluted and democratized? Historians still argue whether the wild tulip's presence in Anatolia influenced Ottoman taste, or if it was the other way around. You suspect the answer is both. In a small town market, you spot a child selling bulbs wrapped in fabric. They're good ones, she says confidently. You smile, because that crooked bulb is probably the most honest tulip you've seen all day. The road leads on. You pass crumbling caravanserais, old Roman ruins, and the occasional goat that clearly runs this place. Time folds a bit here. Back in Istanbul, the palaces are quieter now. The empire lurches on. Different sultans rise and fall. No rebellion here. No lanterns. Just earth, sky, and petals. And somehow, it feels like this is where the tulip always belonged. Your journey tilts back toward Istanbul once more. But time has shifted. Years have passed. Decades, even. The city you return to is older. Its edges are worn, like a favorite coat. Frayed but familiar. And a tulip era once scandal, once spectacles, now memory, myth, and motif. Tulip designs continued to flourish in Ottoman ceramics, textiles, miniatures, and architecture. The ceilings are simpler now. The walls less ornate, but still, the tulip appears etched into window frames, stitched into curtains, painted onto faded porcelain bowls, stacked neatly in cabinets. No longer a show of excess. It has become a quiet declaration. We remember the flower evolved from a symbol of imperial indulgence into one of cultural identity, quiet, proud, and deeply rooted. You walk again through the outer gardens of the palace, where the tulips bloom once more. Just the sound of water, the flicker of light on stone, and tulips blooming patiently. A boy carries a bunch of tulips wrapped in newspaper, of how even the softest things leave lasting marks. A cafe uses tulip-shaped glassware for its tea. A mural on a school wall shows a girl watering a tulip with a paintbrush. Not in wild fanfare, but with a subtle grace. No more golden fountains or mechanical swans, just soft beds of petals waving in the breeze, tended by gardeners who hum old folk songs under their breath. But somehow what stays with you now is the in-between. A gardener's fingers brushing soil from a bulb, a scribe drawing a tulip in the margin of a prayer book, a servant stealing one last look at the blooms before they fell. An elderly man sits nearby, sketching tulips in a small notebook. His lines are shaky, but the tulip he draws is unmistakably proud. "I never saw the festivals," he says, "but my grandfather did. Said it felt like the world had stopped just to admire a flower." Mainstream fact. Though the tulip era officially ended with the rebellion of 1730, its cultural imprint lingered. You enter a modest pavilion built decades after Ahmed's abdication. A fringe tidbit: in the late 18th century, a small calligraphy manual was published that used the tulip as a teaching tool. Each loop and curve of the Ottoman script was matched with a petals line, suggesting that learning to write beautifully was like tending a flower, slow, intentional, poetic. Some say Ahmed III was naive. Others argue he was a visionary, trying to steer the empire away from war and toward beauty, science, and self. You sit beside a fountain that still runs, though now it sings only for those who stop long enough to listen. And perhaps that was the point. Historians still debate whether the tulip era was a golden age of culture or a foolish detour that weakened the empire. But here, in this quiet pavilion, there's no debate. You walk through the streets of the city one last time. It's no longer a symbol of imperial excess. It's just ... a tulip, a reminder of fragility, of beauty. You remember the palace gardens in their prime, the lanterns, the silk, the sherbet, and you remember the rebellion, the cracked fountains, the smoke. The tulip era wasn't forever. It wasn't meant to be, but neither was it meaningless. So here you are back at the beginning, but also at the end. You're standing once again beneath the quiet domes of Topkapi, looking out over the Bosphorus as the sky shifts from dusty pink to navy. The city exhales below you. The stories have all been told now, or at least whispered between petals, tucked into ledgers, or scribbled in the margins of forgotten books. And the Sultan, he's gone. A fallen gardener watching the empire change from a walled courtyard. He died in 1736. Ahmed III, the man who dreamed of flowers instead of conquests. who gambled on grace instead of force, now lives only in footnotes and folk songs. A failed ruler to some, a misunderstood reformer to others, but undeniably, a man who once made the entire empire stop and smell the tulips. Mainstream fact. Ahmed III spent the rest of his life 6 quiet years under palace confinement after his abdication. He was neither executed nor exiled. Just ... set aside. Gardeners called it the forgotten bloom. It rarely flowered, but when it did, they said it always tilted slightly toward the old harem walls, as if looking for the past. It blooms. It wilts. It grows again, sometimes in surprising places. You walk past what was once his personal tulip garden. It's smaller now. The palace doesn't fund floristry like it used to. A blueprint for gentler ambitions. A whispered reminder that empires are not only made of steel and fire, but of ink, water, and bloom. The lanterns flicker, casting long shadows over the gravel path. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale sings, unbothered by the fall of empires. Just the pulse of breath, the hush of twilight, and the soft weight of history curling around you like a blanket. The tulips, those few still standing, sway, gently nodding as if to say, you made it, you walked the garden, you saw it all. But some bulbs still bloom. A few old varieties survived, deep red, faintly streaked, as if still blushing from memory. The fringe tidbit. A single tulip bulb from the original royal collection reportedly remained planted continuously for centuries in one neglected palace corner. Historians still argue whether the tulip era should be mourned or mocked. But the truth is, history doesn't care. You've wandered far, you've learned much, and you've earned your rest. As the last call to prayer echoes across the domes, you linger in the fading light, letting it all wash over you. Every garden, every rebellion, every petal and poem and foolish, fragrant dream, because while Ahmed's tulips may not have saved the empire, they left behind something softer, and maybe that's enough. Now the wind down begins. Slow, soft, steady. You feel the evening settle around you like a silk shawl. You sit beside a quiet pool and close your eyes. The water burbles gently, a breeze stirs the trees, and in that stillness, the past folds in on itself like petals at dusk. There are no more fireworks, no more sherbet carts. You remember a line from a forgotten poet, something you saw once inked in a garden ledger. The flower does not mourn the bloom it lost. It waits for spring and opens again. So now, let your breath slow. Let your thoughts grow softer. Let the garden close gently behind you and sleep. Hey guys, tonight we slip into velvet slippers, quiet as shadows, and tiptoe into a garden blooming under moonlight. You're standing just beyond the golden gates of Topkapi Palace in But this isn't a tense diplomatic summit or some grim battlefield planning. A moment, a long breath between battles. You watch a servant, dressed in crimson and cream, pour chilled sherbet into cups shaped like blooming tulips. I love making these strange historical rabbit holes for you. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're retuning in from and what time it is where you are. Always curious how far the Ottoman night stretches. Ahmed ruled from 1703 to 1730, just 27 years, in the shadowy middle of Ottoman decline. The empire had ballooned beyond its core, and now sagged at the edges like a too full pastry. Provinces were rebelling, coffers were strained, and military prestige had definitely seen better centuries. Above, fireworks crackle like fairy lights, and Ahmed smiles. Behind him, a miniature painter sketches the Sultan beneath a tulip arch. Each line so delicate it looks like it might float away on the wind. But beneath the silks and poetry, You feel a tension in the air like a string pulled too tight. A single wrong note and the whole garden might collapse. Not just in an aisle fund a few mosques away, but in a let's throw a 15-day party for my grandson's circumcision, complete with dancing elephants and mechanical sea monsters kind of way. The Sultan lifts a bulb from a velvet tray like it's a diamond. Courtiers nod gravely. A gardener bows so low his turban brushes the soil. A tulip isn't just a flower, it's currency, status symbol, political tool, and in this moment, Ahmed III is king of it all. Some see the tulip era as an early Enlightenment echo, a time when the Ottomans were trying to import European science, engineering, just a drifting spirit on this late-night garden path, lost in a dream that once bloomed beneath real stars. And printing presses, yes, even the dreaded printing press, which had been banned in the empire for centuries. Others argue that all this happened while ignoring deeper rot, corruption, rising taxes, and military unrest. Yup, real mechanical sea monsters. Imagine one of those swan paddle boats you rent on a lake butt, powered by hydraulics, and shaped like a crocodile with a scepter. You blink. Yep, that happened. You're witnessing a sultan more interested in cultivating rare bulbs than empire-wide reforms. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this place if you came from the Janissaries or the countryside, but as a sleepy onlooker wrapped in shadows, you'll do just fine. The garden around you has been landscaped with such precision that even the fireflies seem to be choreographed. The tulips come in subtle gradients, scarlet fading into gold, violet tinged with silver, and you realize something odd. These aren't like the blunt, cheerful tulips you buy at a grocery store today. These are intricate, narrow-petaled, almost feathered at the edges. The Ottomans spread them that way. Needle tulips. They called them symbols of refinement, status, and exquisite taste. No, this is a party. A very, very flowery party. And at the heart of it all is one man, Sultan Ahmed III. Picture him gliding through crowds of courtiers and eunuchs, silks brushing the petals of tulips that stretch in beds so dense they look like woven carpets. Candles flicker inside glass lanterns, shaped like blossoms, and music hums in the background like a lullaby wrapped in oud and You're here during what later historians would call the Tulip era, although the Ottomans themselves didn't think of it as a proper register vibe. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You smell roses first, not tulips. The Ottomans were actually kind of indifferent to the scentless tulip at first, preferring the lush aroma of roses or the crisp coolness of mint. But somewhere along the line, somewhere in the chaos of trade routes, an imperial Taysar shift happened. A flower native to Central Asia, cultivated in Persia, and stylized in miniature paintings began to hypnotize the upper classes of Istanbul. And so here you are, wrapped in night, wandering through the dream world of Ahmed III, the Sultan who loved tulips almost too much. He wasn't supposed to be anything special, not a conqueror like Mehmed the Conqueror, not a builder like Suleiman the Magnificent, but what Ahmed lacked in martial ambition, he made up for in aesthetic vision. He loved beauty. Historians still argue whether Ahmed III was a decadent fool avoiding the empire's problems or a savvy statesman ushering in a rare moment of peace. But for now, all you hear is laughter. You pass a scholar reciting a ghazal, a poem that compares the fleeting beauty of a tulip to a forbidden love, to a divine mystery, to a cup of wine that will never be poured. It's peaceful, absurdly so. You almost forget the rest of the world exists beyond these marble walls and petaled borders. Still, for now, it's all petals and perfume. You, on the other hand, are perfectly anonymous. The air cools slightly as you leave the palace gardens behind, but the scent of crushed tulip stems still clings faintly to your sleeves. You walk slower now, deeper into the fabric of the empire, the once terrifying Ottoman Empire. Remember, the folks who had Vienna shaking in its boots just a few generations earlier is now in what polite historians call the long decline. Less polite ones, they'd say the wheels were already coming off. Out here, beyond the fountains and floral arches of Topkapi, the Ottoman world isn't quite so perfumed. A provincial governor quietly bribes his way out of inspection. Somewhere in the eastern provinces, another rebellion is flickering like a lantern, about to catch fire. And yet back in Istanbul, the court is hosting elaborate garden banquet, commissioning elaborate porcelain tulip vases, and importing rare bulbs from distant lands with the same excitement you might reserve for a new iPhone drop. The wealthier quarters, near the Bosphorus, are being transformed. Gardens bloom in front of summer pavilions. Tulip beds line public fountains. Even middle-class households are starting to grow bulbs in clay pots, hoping to mimic the palace's aesthetic in miniature. It's fraying at the edges like an old rug, the kind with a beautiful center but torn fringe. And pirates still roam parts of the Mediterranean like it's casual Tuesday. The empire's upper crust has become obsessed with beauty, symmetry, refinement. Everything has to look effortless even when it's very much not. Like a tulip, basically. Imagine flipping pages of poetic bulb names like Blue Flame of Samarkand or Golden Fang of Persia. He's not wrong. The empire's grain shipments were becoming unreliable. Poor harvests and corrupt administrators had caused shortages in places like Anatolia and the Balkans. But Ahmed seemed unbothered, or maybe just convinced, that distraction and beauty were better than fear and famine. The year is 1703, and things have not been going particularly well. Another whispers about bulb forgeries, people painting stripes on tulips to mimic more expensive breeds. You catch a glimpse of Ahmed again, seated beneath a lattice pavilion, cradling a single tulip between gloved fingers, like it might whisper the future to him. Around him, the court watches silently. Some scholars suggest that Ahmed's reign bought time a fragile, flowery bubble that delayed worse instability. Others argue it was wasted effort, blindfolding the empire with petals. He's not dumb, though. Not even close. There's something both charming and absurd about it all. Like a kingdom slowly falling asleep to the sound of flute music and bee wings. While he's arranging petal colors and commissioning poetry, he's also supporting the creation of Istanbul's first imperial library, introducing printing technology with careful limits and bringing European science texts into the city via translators. The Sultan is planting seeds both literal and metaphorical even. If no one is entirely sure what he hopes will grow, it's not a black market, exactly. But it's definitely more like tulip grey market activity. Like NFT fraud, but with pollen. His predecessor Mustafa II had been overthrown in what can only be described as an elite tantrum by the Janissaries, the empire's elite corps of military muscle, and when they forced Ahmed into power, he did what any cautious leader would do when handed a poisoned crown. He smiled, nodded, and immediately tried to keep them happy while quietly reshaping the system behind the scenes. But printers weren't exactly the TikTok stars of their day. They were feared. Many scribes believed mechanical printing would destroy their livelihoods, and conservative religious leaders saw it as a dangerous technology that could spread heresy as easily as it spread poetry. The compromise: only non-religious texts could be printed, and even those had to be approved. You pass merchants grumbling over unstable coinage. This is the paradox of the tulip era. You feel it like warm silk draped over splinters. Was Ahmed giving his court something beautiful to focus on while he struggled to govern a restless empire? Or was it more like the band on the Titanic, playing music while the hull filled with water? Ahmed III ascended the throne during one of the most awkward transitions in Ottoman history. Ahmed was no military genius. He didn't push new borders or win epic battles. Instead, he focused inward, on culture, on luxury, on distraction. Really, and nowhere was this more obvious than in the empire's newfound obsession with tulips. Historians still argue whether this was a deliberate coping strategy or a symptom of deeper dysfunction. You wander through the neighborhoods of Istanbul and see this tension playing out in real time. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the empire, there are provinces that haven't seen a tax collector, a bag of fresh grain in months. Soldiers are underpaid. Roads are crumbling. And yet, in the capital, there's a new energy. You overhear an artisan complaining that a single rare tulip bulb now costs more than a camel. And through it all, Ahmed floats along with that serene, sleepy smile, a mainstream fact. Ahmed's court reintroduced the printing press in to Keisha Smolak with massive cultural implications. A fringe tidbit. It's rumored that the Sultan himself kept a private tulip Legaran ornate, handwritten book listing every bulb in his personal collection, with its name, origin, color profile, and bloom time. You hear a scholar murmur something under his breath. A flower does not feed a child. Historians still debate if the tulip era was a last gasp of joy before disaster, or an elegant strategy to keep spirits lifted during a slow-motion crisis. But you keep walking, past fountains with blooming stone tulips, past scribes writing odes to flowers instead of protests, and as you step into the next garden courtyard, the soft click of your sandals on mosaic tiles echoes beneath rose-covered arches. No one speaks of war, or hunger, or rebellion. They just admire the petals.
The tulips you see tonight didn't just sprout by accident in Ottoman soil. They arrived here by slow caravan, merchant ship, and imperial gift basket planted not only in gardens. This is where tulips began to operate as soft diplomacy. But in the minds of poets, diplomats, and nobles, who realized early on this flower could do more than decorate a courtyard, like the Ottoman version of a well-worded email with a mysterious smiley face. Her ranking officials would gather in their most elegant kaftans to admire the blooms and recite poetry beneath lantern-lit arches. These weren't just parties, they were performances of power and taste. It's probably apocryphal but just ridiculous enough to be plausible. You try not to laugh. Was it just posturing window dressing for a court that had fewer real tools of power than before? Or did it actually help smooth tensions in an age when war wasn't always the best option? You wouldn't think a flower could do all that. But this is the age when aesthetics and status were inseparable. A rare tulip was as much a currency as gold or silver. But look closer, and you notice each tulip represents a different empire, some tall and bold, some narrow and fading, some bend just slightly toward the Ottoman stem in the center. Imagine getting a bulb in the mail and knowing it meant stay in line. Or else, it's a soft invasion not with troops, but with petals. It's not just a garden, it's a metaphor. He wasn't being poetic, he meant it literally. The tulip had become the Ottoman Empire's signature scent. Its calling card, its national aesthetic. You can't tax it, you can't control it, and you certainly can't rush it. All you can do is wait and admire. That's harder to measure. Alongside textiles, spices, and illustrated tulip bulbs are carefully wrapped in parchment, each labeled by breed and bloom time. It's a science, this floral messaging system. In fact, it might have been more valuable because it couldn't just be minted. The Sultan is inside, discussing bulb exchanges with his garden steward. Outside, the empire waits unimpressed, perhaps by diplomacy written in petals. You overhear an older soldier mutter, "We used to send swords. Now we send flowers." He shakes his head and walks away, boots clicking on stone. There's a weight behind that comment, a deep anxiety that all this blooming means something is rotting underneath. It had to be grown, nurtured, protected from mold and bulb thieves. Under his rule, tulips travel. They go with envoys to European courts, where nobles marvel at their variety. Some even believe the Ottomans invented the flower, which isn't true, but the empire certainly perfected its role in spectacle. It could smooth over politics, signal sophistication, and make a statement without anyone saying a word. You're walking now along the corridors of power, not the glittering halls of Topkapi, but the quieter channels, marriage proposals, treaties, and foreign correspondence. It starts subtly. A vizier sends a rare striped bulb to a rival pasha whose loyalties he is not entirely sure about. The bulb is wrapped in silk and accompanied by a handwritten verse comparing its color to the blush of dawn. A risky gift, but a calculated one. Accept the flower, and you're signaling openness. Refuse it. That's a message, too. Beneath a canopy woven from grapevines and gauze, ambassadors from Venice and France drink sweetened rosewater and pretend not to compete over whose tulip breed is rarer. The Sultan's men make polite conversation while watching for any reaction to the gifts exchanged. An Italian snuff box here. A miniature cur on there. But always a tulip or a tulip motif somewhere in the mix. Over time, tulips become tools of flirtation, not just romantic, but political. Mainstream fact time. The Ottoman court developed a whole seasonal ritual around tulips. Annual tulip viewing events hosted by the elite. Much like Japan's cherry blossom festivals, you slip into one such gathering, quietly. A fringe tidbit. There's a rumor that one Dutch ambassador, eager to impress Ahmed's court, painted tulips on the soles of his slippers, so that even his footsteps would show deference to the empire's blooming obsession. Historians still argue whether tulip diplomacy actually achieved anything lasting. You pause in front of a mural commissioned during this time. It shows a field of tulips swaying in the wind, each one painted slightly differently. Tulips also appeared in courtly gifts to provincial governors, suggesting approval or subtle guidance. You wander through a back room of Topkapi where scribes are preparing gift lists for a diplomatic visit from Persia. And yet, not everyone is convinced. Ahmed doesn't see it that way, or maybe he does, and he just prefers to focus on what's lovely for as long as he can. You see it in the embroidery on kaftans, in the calligraphy curling like vines around domed ceilings, in the miniature paintings where even the tiniest details hide tulips. And you can help but feel it as a bit like Instagram diplomacy. Perfectly curated, highly aesthetic, and quietly performative, but effective. In one embassy report, a French noble comments that the Ottomans have made of flowers what we make of jewels, and in a way you understand why. When your borders are tense and your army restless, what better distraction than a bloom that only appears for a few fragile days? The sun sets over Istanbul. Again, as you step onto a terrace overlooking the Bosphorus, a breeze stirs the curtains. Still, the tulips continue to bloom, at least for now.